an actual dissection. And so we're looking at the spinal cord here. We can see the dura there. There would be the dura. This is the cord. You can see the spinal arteries going up and down the cord. And then you can see our roots. This would be one of the roots coming here. And it's kind of hard to differentiate in this illustration, the dorsal from the ventral root. We'll talk more about that later. But the SN, you can see the root coming down this way. The SN would stand for what? Spinal nerve. Yeah, that would be where they come together. And then what's going to happen is that spinal nerve is going to branch into a ventral and dorsal branch. But that's the general organization we've been talking about. You can see that they're descending like this because of the disparity between the lengths of the spinal cord and the spinal column. We won't spend too much time talking about this, but for anatomy, you should know that these neurons are extremely long cells, or at least they can be extremely long cells. We saw the illustration of the sensory neuron earlier. We saw the cell body in the DRG, the dorsal root ganglion. We saw that one end of that sensory neuron went all the way to the cord, the other end went all the way out to your, wherever the sensation is being generated. So, for example, we use the hand or the foot. That neuron. Well, let me ask you this: are there any neurons in my finger? Are there any neurons in my finger?
Yes.
We have yeses and nos. What you need to make sure you understand, the reason we're talking about, there are no neurons in my finger. There are no neurons in my finger. By that, I mean there are no cells, including a cell body and a fiber or process extending from that cell body as a neuron. There are no neurons in my finger. What are going to be in my finger are little neural endings, axonal terminals, and in some cases receptors. We'll talk about that in physiology. But in any case, that axon, that sensory axon, is going to extend all the way from my fingertip, through my finger, into my hand, wrist, forearm, arm, shoulder, thorax, and go all the way to the spinal cord. All right? So that's a fairly long cell. Of course, if it's a motor cell, the same sort of thing. If I'm going to move the intrinsic muscles of the hand or the foot, it has to be comparably long. Yeah.
So there are no neural cells peripherally from the spinal nerve or the spinal cord?
I'm not sure quite of the distinction. There are no neuronal cell bodies anywhere in that sensory circuit except in the cord and the neural-associated structures. Yeah. So what we have going out to the skin are axons for the most part. And we'll talk about the terminology of that. It gets a little confusing with sensory neurons and so on. But I just want you to understand that these neurons are extremely long. They have extremely long cytoplasmic pathways, and that's something we'll address with physiology. But let's say it's a motor neuron we're talking about. And now we're going the other way. We're sending a signal from the spinal cord. And by the way, where's the cell body that moves the lumbricals in your hand? Where's that cell body located?
Anterior horn.
In the ventral root of the cord. In the ventral root of the cord, and then there's going to be one long axon going all the way out to the lumbrical muscles that are located inside the hand. All right. So my next question for you is, what happens if that long axon is severed? What happens to your ability to move the lumbricals? What happens to the lumbrical muscle? What happens to the neuronal body? I'm sorry? All right, so let's work through that. And by the way, this is called Wallerian degeneration. The first thing, and most important thing to remember, is that the half or the fragment of the neuron that's been severed from the body is going to immediately begin degeneration within hours. That's what we're talking about here, Wallerian degeneration. And that will continue. And I think you implied there when I asked the question, the muscle to which that nerve is attached, the skeletal muscle, will also begin to atrophy because it no longer, it depends upon the neural signal to contract. So it's going to begin degeneration too. Eventually, the proximal neuron If it doesn't take up another line of work, it's going to atrophy as well. But in any case, when we talk about Wallerian degeneration, I just want you to be thinking about this, and thinking about the spinal cord, spinal patients that you're going to have to deal with and how complicated that gets. What we're looking at here is the general sequence of events that tends to happen. In general, the axon itself, once it's been severed, will not reattach. It has no capacity for reattachment unless the connective tissue around it, the endoneurium and the Schwann cells, are either intact or have the ability to regenerate another little tube through which it can grow. And of course, there are all sorts of therapies now facilitating that process, creating an artificial tube and then lining it with trophic factors that are basically chemically telling the nerve, come this way, come this way. But in any case, and I don't know if I have a picture of it here, what's called a growth cone. You can see the severance here, and you can see the disruption. So if that tube is able to reform itself, then the neurite may reappear. Otherwise, it won't happen. What you get is something called a growth cone, which is this thing. It's a non-productive, useless aggregation or sprouting of the. This is, I think these are the old slides. You have different percentages you're complaining about here. No, I think I did. But the same principle would apply. I don't know why I have these. We'll get to the forensic specialists on this, but I know that I must not have changed it out properly. But in any case, the only thing I want you to be aware of what we're talking about is that if a motor, well, the afferent's a little bit different, but if a motor neuron is severed, that long cytoplasmic extension is severed, Wallerian degeneration will follow. That begins with deterioration, destruction, necrosis of the distal segment. The proximal segment will sometimes often form this unproductive and problematic growth cone because it's sort of desperately seeking a way to regenerate. But that regeneration generally will only occur if the connective tissue and neurolemma is present for it to grow. Wallerian degeneration. I think that's all we have to say about that.
Is that only in motor neuron?
No, it's just the process is a little more complicated because most of our examples that we've talked about in both courses now have dealt with the multipolar neurons. Same thing applies to an afferent. Yeah. Yeah.
Go back 2 slides. That one. So in the third picture down, so that the growth cone is the larger end of the distal nerve there.
Well, in this case, they're actually showing a degree of regeneration. The implication is the growth cone is not forming as it did in the absence of the connective tissue. But I think the implication here is that the polypodia are proceeding because you have some fragments of the connective tissue still remaining. If none of this is present, you'll just get a pubescence of fibers sort of shooting in all directions.
And so the old one is sort of just off to the side.
Yeah, this would be a non-productive or non.
On the other side. So that's sort of the old ending off to the right and the new.
Yeah, I think what's showing here, there was a severance here, but as long as this endoneurium is present, that's guiding the polypodia and the axon in the proper direction. So here you are getting some regeneration. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about every healthcare science student's favorite topic, the autonomic nervous system. Talk a little bit about the organization of this. Again, our purpose today is not to understand autonomic function, but simply to describe the anatomy associated with the ANS. Now, in terms of how we classify it, it's problematic because remember an earlier point in the physiology course, we pointed out that there are two systems that are primarily dedicated to physiological homeostasis. What were they? Endocrine and autonomic. And by an autonomic process, we're talking about such things as regulation of your heart rate, regulation of your respiratory rate, regulation of the hormone levels in the blood, and so on, blood gas levels. By and large, you can't voluntarily change those things. We're just talking about, I don't know, years of yoga or something. You don't really have the capacity to change those autonomic. And so my point is, if the brain, the hypothalamus and brainstem, are formulating signals, neural signals, conducted through the autonomic nervous system to the heart, to the respiratory system, that you're not aware of, to what degree can you change them? You really can't. You really can't alter those. Those are homeostatic mechanisms operating by pathways that are not traditionally voluntary. So, again, a homeostatic system, we can see that what we're looking at here, I guess this is the best illustration, what we're looking at here is the parasympathetic pathway that innervates most of the thorax, for example, the thoracoabdominal structures. And with respect to whether this system is efferent or afferent, in order for the brain, the hypothalamus, for the brainstem to regulate your heart, you would agree that's efferent, right? Right, that's a signal going through the brain. But what information is the hypothalamus and brainstem using to regulate your heart rate? Are you telling it that information now? What information is it using and how does it acquire it?
Hormones?
All right, hormones would be good, but I would say that there's other mechanisms for doing so.
Yeah, bioreceptors, I mean, all kinds of.
Baroreceptors, chemoreceptors, things over which you have little control. But my question for you there is, are those sensory structures or motor structures? Sensory. So what I want you to understand is that although most textbooks classify the ANS as an efferent, as a component of the efferent peripheral nervous system, you should realize that it's really both. It's both efferent and afferent. It's sending signals to vital tissues, but it's also collecting signals from those tissues. And so it's this constant interchange of information that is being used to regulate all of these autonomic processes.
So for test purposes, so should we consider it as both?
Yeah, I think so. Again, as some of you have already found and asked, I often have the dilemma of dealing with whether we should talk about what's going to be on your PANCE exam, or what is fact, what is true. And so I just try to give you both bits of information and let you make the executive decision with your singular gyrus up here. I'm going to skip that topic. All right, so there are two divisions of the autonomic nervous system, the sympathetic and parasympathetic. And fortunately for our discussion of anatomy, they're more or less differentiated anatomically. The sympathetic is also called the thoracolumbar. And the parasympathetic is called the craniosacral. So the efferents that supply tissues sympathetically pretty much emanate from the cord in the thorax and the lumbar region. Parasympathetic basically in the head and the tail, head and the butt. So that kind of makes it a little easier for us to keep at least the anatomy straight. The other thing you should keep in mind with respect to the general anatomy of the autonomic nervous system is the organization of neurons. Now, this is a little bit complicated, but I said that the cell body, or you told me actually, that the cell body that moves the lumbricals in the hand is located where? In the ventral horn of the cord. How many neurons are there that are responsible between the cord and the lumbricals? How many neurons then are necessary for that movement? How many neurons are involved in that pathway between the cord, from the cord? One. So there's one neuron in the motor pathway from the cord to the muscle. Is that clear?
Mm-hmm.
The cell body in the ventral horn going all the way out to the muscle. And if you saw the illustration of the sensory neuron. If it's a free nerve ending located in the fingertip, where's that cell body located? Is it in your finger? No, where is it? The dorsal root ganglion, adjacent to the cord, and then it goes on by that into the. So again, how many neurons are there in a typical somatosensory pathway? One. But the ANS is different. All autonomic pathways, well, virtually all autonomic pathways, and you're going to yell at me later if I say that, virtually all autonomic pathways involve two neurons between the cord and the effector, such as the GI tract, or the sweat gland, or something like that. The two neurons, called two of them, are going to synapse at a cluster. What do we call a cluster of neurons in the ganglion? They're going to cluster at a ganglion. So therefore, we call the first one a preganglionic neuron and the second one a postganglionic. And you can see even that terminology is biased, because if we say pre and post with reference to the spinal cord, does that imply an efferent or afferent system? Efferent, yeah, implies that that's not entirely true. Just want to alert you to the problems that you're going to encounter later. So we're going to call the preganglionic neuron the one that extends from the spinal cord to the ganglion, and the postganglionic neuron the one that extends in the autonomic pathway from the ganglion to the target tissue. All right, we already talked about this. So if you look at our illustration here, I'm not going to get into, oh, I know what I'm doing. We'll come back to that. So let's just finish our organization here. Apparently, I've gone back to the somatic nervous system. I apologize. So here's the spinal transection of the spinal cord here. And can anybody tell me, as you look at the transection of the spinal cord, which side is sensory, which side is motor? The sensory at the top or the bottom? All right. You can see that these are the dorsal horns. You can see they go all the way out to the periphery of the gray matter. So these things right here would be what? Dorsal rootlets or sensory rootlets. Here's going to be our dorsal root. This is going to be our ventral rootlets and ventral root. What do you think this large enlargement here is? The dorsal root ganglion. And remember, is that a sensory or motor ganglion?
Both.
Sensory. Is it an autonomic ganglion? No. So we've learned another ganglion that we have to differentiate from this. So this is a sensory ganglion. And now, when these two roots converge, they converge to form what? The spinal nerve. And then that spinal nerve is going to in turn branch into a posterior and anterior part. This is the posterior ramus, and this is the anterior or ventral ramus. Now, as you look at this, as you look at the figure, this is the back here. And so very logically, the posterior ramus, which is relatively small, innervates, both in terms of motor function and sensory function, at least in the thoracic region, the back. The anterior ramus innervates everything else, anterior and lateral walls in the thoracic region. And that's why it's much larger. Now, what this is the autonomic nervous system. But it's part of it. That's part of the sympathetic nervous system we're going to talk about in just a moment. This is a very important component of that. Don't worry too much about this classification. I think it's largely discarded. We're going to talk about these terms here a little later, but I don't think we're ready to handle these yet. As the old movie line goes, you can't handle the truth at this point. So we'll come back to that a little later. So we talked about the organization of sensory nerves. We've indicated that, at least for somatosensory neurons, the cell body is located in a DRG. There are several types of somatosensation or somatic sensation. There is Exteroreception, your ability to interact with the world around you. We're talking primarily about things such as pressure, temperature, pain, and so on. The proper term, the physiological term for pain sensation is nociception. Nociception. It's not quite true. Later we'll talk about a semantic distinction between pain and nociception. But for now, we'll just call nociceptors pain receptors and leave it at that. We've defined proprioception. What is proprioception? Your awareness of what all the parts of your body are doing in relation to one another, your ability to coordinate all those parts in relation to one another. This would be a manifestation of capable proprioception. So we've established that the dorsal root is a sensory structure, and the dorsal root is an aggregation of lots of neuronal fibers, sensory fibers, that are all coming into the spinal cord and are going to enter via the dorsal horn. All right. But where are they coming from? Where are those sensory fibers that enter any given dorsal root located? How many dorsal roots do you have in your neck, or at least in the cervical region of the cord? Remember? 8 pairs, right? So at each one of those 8 pairs, each one of those levels, there's going to be the input, the sensory signals coming from a specific region of the body. The specific region of the body that's associated with each dorsal root is called a dermatome. Dermatome, and you can see them broken down in the figure over here on the right. So if you look for C2, what is the region of innervation of C2? It's the back of your head there. What's the region of innervation for C5, for example? Well, it's sort of a little ribbon, a little strip right there in your neck. When we talked about neurological assessment, you're going to use your understanding of dermatomes to assess your patients neurologically to see if their sensorium is intact. And we'll come back to this later. Like, you don't have to memorize this now, but I just want you to be aware of what a dermatome is. Quite literally, it's the region of skin supplied by a single dorsal root. It's the region of skin supplied by a single dorsal root. That's a dermatome. What's a myotome? Yes, it is all of the muscles supplied by a single ventral root. All of the muscles supplied by a single ventral root. Also, you sort of see them illustrated here in the illustration. It's very simplistically. As I say, at this point, I'm not going to ask you to remember these, but I'm just sort of giving you a couple of different tables and graphs to help you later. A little later, you will have to learn a few of the diagnostic myotomes and dermatomes. All right, so let's get back to what we were talking about. I'm not sure how that got put in there. And I still don't want to talk about visceral yet. You can't make it, not until we talk about a few other points. So you would agree that we're looking at the spinal column here. Here's our spinal column. Inside the spinal column, each side of these vertebrae, there's going to be a vertebral canal. There's going to be the spinal cord in there. But I'll direct your attention to these structures on either side of the spinal column. Notice we have one here and one here. Those are the sympathetic chain ganglia. Sympathetic chain ganglia, also called, because they run alongside the vertebra here, paravertebral ganglia. Sympathetic ganglia or paravertebral ganglia. Now, in general, where will we find these? What's the other term for the sympathetic division of the ANS? Huh? The thoracolumbar. The thoracolumbar nervous system. Now, you should immediately begin asking, if this stupid sympathetic nervous system is called the thoracolumbar system, why do I see ganglia up here in the neck and all the way down in the butt? Anybody have an answer to that? And the answer is, if you want to get to Cape Coral today, how do you get to Cape Coral? Can you just start out here and get on a highway and go directly to Cape Coral? You're going to have to get across what first? You have to get across the river, and there are only a few places you can do that, right? You can't, unless you happen to have a car that's more capable than mine. You have to take a bridge. And so here's the deal. These things connect to the spinal cord only in the region of the thorax and the lumbar vertebrae. All right, so the bridges between the cord and the chain ganglia are only present in the thoracolumbar region. Another way of stating that is these ganglia up here at the top are good. Any signal is passing through this thing here called the superior cervical ganglia. How is it going to get to the spinal cord? What's the shortest route? Can it go just like that? No, it's going to have to go all the way down and cross over. So let me say that again. These yellow things that you see here on either side form the sympathetic or paravertebral ganglia, which are the essence of the anatomical essence of the sympathetic nervous system. The sympathetic nervous system is also called the thoracolumbar system because the connections between the spinal cord and those ganglia are only present in the thoracic and the lumbar regions of the cord. My brain has decided that my heart should beat more rapidly. Now let's take a better example. My brain has decided that my pupils should enlarge. Explain the pathway, the motor pathway. That signal is going to originate in the hypothalamus and brainstem. Then where is it going to go? Where does the fiber that's telling me that the motor neuron that's telling the pupils to dilate? Where is it coming from? Is it coming right here from your brain and going right to your eye?
C2.
Yeah.
Well, you're very close. It's actually lower than that. It's actually going all the way down to T1 or C8, all the way down. Not C2. There's no connection between C2 and you're looking at something. Let me know what you're looking at because there's no connection there. So that's my point. I want to make sure you understand that if a signal is coming down the cord, it has to innervate a structure in the head. It has to come all the way down to about here, go up, and then go over, and then go back up. Why is that? Why is this called the thoracolumbar system? Because the connections between the yellow things and the cord are only present in the thoracic and lumbar region. Yes, please.
So the dermatomes, I don't understand.
No, dermatomes are not autonomic. Dermatomes are somatic. All right, so let's make sure we understand this again. Sensory structures are if we're talking about somatic senses. Let's say temperature. Let's say temperature sensation in the skin. All right. Where is the cell body located that affords that information to your brain? That brings that information. It's in the dorsal root ganglia of that level. So if you tap on the back of your head, let's go back to the illustration of the dermatome. Oops. You tap on the back of your head. Where is that DRG located? Tapping right back here. Let's say. Yeah, it's going to be at C2. That's sensory, not autonomic. Do you all see the distinction? But I asked you before, how many neurons are there in a sensory pathway between the sensation and the cord? How many are there? One. Yeah. That's for the sensory, not for the autonomic. The autonomic is an entirely different animal, involving two neurons and entirely different pathways. Please don't confuse, although we're going to have to deal with autonomic sensation a little later. That's why I keep putting that. I don't want to talk about visceral sensations right now. So, me see if I can go back, find an illustration. What we're looking at here, if you want to, if I want to contract my biceps, can somebody take me through the pathway looking at this illustration? Where is the cell body located that's responsible for contracting the brachialis or the biceps brachii? Oh, it's going to be in the ventral, of course I'm simplifying this. It's going to be in the ventral horn, which is at the bottom. It's going to pass through the ventral root. It's going to go through the spinal nerve here. It's going to go through the ventral ramus. All right, that's one neuron located in the ventral root of the cord. That's a motor pathway. If we're talking about a sensory, like a bug bite on your arm there, anterior arm, where is the neuronal cell body going to be located that is responsible for detecting that pain? All right, it's going to be right there. Right? And then the axon is going to come through here and go into the dorsal side. Okay, that's entirely different than the autonomic pathways. And so this is if you are detecting the bug bite. This is kind of reflexive of the question. Are you aware of the bug bite that you're detecting? When a bug bites you, do you know that it's biting you? You don't think so? I really insist that when a bug bites me, I be aware of it. That's the way we roll it here. That's the way my brain works. So my point is, that's a sensation. That's a perception. You are aware of it. Are you aware that if I say we're going to have a quiz in 5 minutes on this very topic, when your heart rate goes up, are you immediately aware of that? No, your respiratory rate goes up. So those are autonomic components. So they involve different pathways, different organizational scheme. So we have motor pathways, we have somatosensory pathways, and then independent, or at least for now, independent of those two are the autonomic pathways. Is that clear? There are two divisions of the autonomic nervous system, the sympathetic and the parasympathetic. We're beginning our discussion of the organization of the sympathetic nervous system because it's the heavier, it's the more complicated. If we finish that, then the parasympathetic is nothing. All right. And so, is that clear though? Have we mixed this potential confusion between the somatosensory system and the autonomic system? Don't confuse them. They're entirely different systems. So if we go back, yeah.
So you're saying the way your brain would communicate to your eyes would be lower in this thoracolumbar system and parasympathetic system. So that's how your brain communicates to your body, but then like C2 being the optic nerve, that's how your body communicates to your brain then? Is that the distinction?
So body communicating to the brain happens in a variety of ways. I'm suggesting that it could be somatosensory. Again, the physical somatic sensation. You're aware of it. That's just back to those DRGs. One neuron from wherever the skin is located back directly to the cord at the level, C2, C3, following the dermatomes. That's somatic sensation. One neuron located for the somatic sensations in the DRG, conducting that signal back to the spinal cord. In fact, as we're going to find out later, it's even longer than that. It typically goes all the way up to your brainstem. So that's sensation. That's sensation. That's just a sensation of which you are aware. Again, are you aware of the signal that's causing your sweat glands to release more fluid? Are you aware of it? No. So that's a different system, a different pathway. And that's the sympathetic or the autonomic pathway. And so it uses an entirely different anatomy than the pathway used by your sensorium to give you awareness of the world around you. You generally aren't aware of what the ANS is doing. And we'll cover this in much more detail in the physiology. Again, all we want to do now is just talk a little bit about the anatomy. So the ANS consists of two parts, two divisions, the sympathetic and parasympathetic. This is the sympathetic. These are the sympathetic chain ganglion that we're looking at right here. And so, is it clear? Does everybody understand why we call the sympathetic the thoracolumbar? Because the connections between these yellow things and the spinal cord, the bridges to Cape Coral, are only present from approximately T1 down to about L2 or 3. Okay. All right, if that's true, then why do I have ganglia in the neck? Why do I have, they're there, but they do not communicate directly with the cord. That's what we were pointing out. I'll make sure you understand that all of these autonomic signals going either way, either motor or sensory, I think of a better way to say that, either efferent or afferent, have to go from here all the way down, I can't see what I'm writing, all the way down to about here, and then back up, or vice versa, depending on whether it's efferent or afferent. Yes?
Wait, so the ganglia then in the cervical just shoot down the signal?
Yeah, it's amazing. It's incredible. We usually have, it's not uncommon for a student in this class or in the nursing class to have something called Horner syndrome, where one eye is a little bit closed all the time. Why is that? If this is true, this pathway is responsible for innervation of certain autonomic eye functions. Is it possible the damage to the neck or the shoulder could affect their ability to close their eyes or their pupil open? Yeah. Because of that crazy pathway. Okay. Is that clear? It makes no sense. Don't try to make sense of it. It's not going to work. This is anatomy and physiology. All right. The other thing I want you to pay attention, because we're just trying to get through the terminology here. Notice that there's one of these little yellow ganglia, and again, these are autonomic ganglia, not sensory ganglia. These are not DRGs. There's one at about every vertebral level until you get to the neck, until you get to the cervical region. How many do you count there? 3. All right, so note that there are 3 cervical ganglia only. You think there would be 8? There are not. There are only 3. And you
That's
can,
3 on each side?
yeah, 3 on each, I'm sorry, 3 on each side, yes. Most of these illustrations only show one side, so I'm a little perplexed by seeing 2 here. I'm just overcome with my sense of luxury. So, yeah, there's 3, superior, middle, and inferior, and later on we'll talk about what they do. That's not too difficult once you understand the anatomy. And then you can see these paravertebral ganglia. What's another word for paravertebral ganglia? Sympathetic chain ganglia. There's the other third thing we'll talk about. Sympathetic trunk, all mean the same thing. They continue down, and then they come together at the butt, the coccyx. And yeah, it's called the ganglion empire. Ganglion empire. That's where the 2 sympathetic trunks come together. I'm trying to throw all these variant terms I can think of just so you'll keep them straight. So the 2 paravertebral ganglia, the 2 sympathetic chain ganglia, the 2 sympathetic trunks converge in the butt, in the coccyx, at the ganglion empire. All right. We'll leave it at that. Is there any direct communication between the sacral trunk and the cord? Is there direct communication between, when I say direct, is there a pathway that goes right across? No, because it only extends down to into the lumbar region. That's why it's called the thoracolumbar artery. You know, there are, in any autonomic pathway, and we're talking about the sympathetic now, there are 2 neurons between the cord and the effector. 2 neurons between the cord and the effector. There's the preganglionic and the postganglionic. This is the ganglia, chain ganglia. So, what we're going to find out is that the synapses can occur in here, along those chain ganglia, or in some cases, and those, again, you know the names for these are called the chain ganglia, paravertebral ganglia. In some cases, we'll talk about in physiology, we won't read in here right now. In some cases, the preganglionic neuron extends its axon through this all the way to these things. I mean, you can see the aorta here, and there are 3 of these: celiac, superior mesenteric, and inferior mesenteric. We won't worry about the names right now, but what I do want you to know is that these 3 ganglia are not paravertebral, They're not part of the sympathetic trunk. These, again, for reasons that absolutely eclipse the mind of any rational person, are called pre-vertebral ganglia. So there are three pre-vertebral ganglia that are part of the sympathetic nervous system. Actually, there is a reason. Why do we call these pre-vertebral?
Because before the birth.
What does pre mean anatomically? In front of the vertebra. So for now, I want you to know that the sympathetic nervous system involves the sympathetic trunk and the paravertebral ganglia. I'm sorry, the prevertebral ganglia, the three of these, and we'll talk about the anatomy a little later. You should know the ganglion impar, and you should know what we mean by a cervical ganglion, and how many of them there are. I might ask you on the quiz, are there sympathetic ganglia in the neck? What would you tell me? Yes. Are there parasympathetic ganglia in the neck? No. So,
Are those the three pre-vertebral ganglia? The
Yeah.
parasympathetic ganglia?
yeah, that's fine. You can call them cervical fibrils. But what you must understand is that in order for those cervical ganglia to communicate with the brain, what's the first opportunity they have to communicate with the brain? CAP1. Because that's where the bridge is located. Yes, so the question was about the thoracic, it's easy. Thoracic and lumbar, they just go right from the cord out to the tissue. Boom, boom, boom. At each level, we saw one of those little yellow things at each level. Where things get complicated are in the neck and the butt, because they have to go from the neck. It has to go down to T1, C8, and if it's in the butt, it has to go up to the lumbar. Now, this looks extremely complicated, and hopefully we will fulfill some of its potential complication a little later. But for now, all I want you to notice is right here. So you know the dorsal horn, you know the ventral horn, all the wonderful memories that's bringing back to you. In the thoracolumbar region of the core, in the thoraco and proximal lumbar cord, you have another little horn. It's sometimes called the lateral horn or the intermediolateral horn. And its function is simply to aggregate sympathetic signals. It's simply the input pathway for the and the output pathway for the sympathetic nervous system. Why do you only find it in the thoraco and lumbar region?
Because that's where the ganglion
That's where the connections are. They're not present in the neck and they're not present in the butt. Don't worry about this now. We'll talk about this later. Just know what we mean by a lateral horn, where it is anatomically. No, I definitely don't want to deal with that right now. What we have here are just some general functions of the sympathetic nervous system. Let's just look at some of these terms and make sure we understand them anatomically. What do we mean by vasomotor tone? Vasomotor tone. Very, arguably the most important role of the sympathetic nervous system.
Dilatation, constriction of blood vessels.
Exactly right. So make sure the answer was constriction and dilation of the, you used the European pronunciation, I don't like it. Because I'm the word. The vasomotor tone is a word you should know. It just refers to regulation of peripheral blood flow by constriction and dilation of peripheral arteries, arterioles, and well, that's pretty much it. So I'm going to make sure we understand this once again. The sympathetic nervous system is regulating peripheral blood flow by changing the size of the blood vessels. It's a very important function. It affects just about every aspect of your body. Vasomotor, pylo. I would say, any of you had a pilotary or depilatory procedure? You probably wouldn't tell me if you did it, right? I had one right up here. Hair. So here we're talking about, when we talk about pilomotor activity, we're talking about the activity of the sympathetic nervous system on the erector pili muscles, and where your hair stand up on end when you get frightened or excited, as you do in here every day. Pseudomotor refers to perspiration. Perspiration is also regulated by the ANS. So I just want you to be familiar with these terms. Some of this I'm going to come back to in just a second. We talked about this. We talked about the pathway, the superior cervical. We'll talk more about that in the physiology. Okay, here's another word. Before we leave, I want you to know this word too. All students love this word, splenic. Splenic, not splenic. And it's a word I'm almost inevitably going to ask you to be able to spell on your quiz. So make sure you write it down. Splenic. And I can think of it without getting into the specific anatomy. I think here's what we need to know about splanchnics. Splanchnics are specialized autonomic pathways between the cord and the viscera. The cord and the viscera. Viscera are organs and organ systems. That's number one. Everybody got that? Number two, all splanchnic nerves are sympathetic with the exception of this one, the exception of the pelvic. Oh, there it is. And we'll go over their anatomy. Believe me, you'll learn the anatomy very thoroughly in the physiology class. But I just in here, I just want you to know that anytime you see the term splanchnic, what's immediately going to come to mind? Is it going to be sensation? Is it going to be motor function? Autonomic, and generally sympathetic, except as I say, with one or two exceptions. All right. So that's all the time we have. I can't believe I didn't finish that. So we'll finish that up Friday, and then we'll move on to a discussion of the head.